Well, good morning, everybody. It's my great honour to introduce Mr. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations and now head of the Kofi Annan Foundation. I think he's probably one of the few people in the world, particularly in a UN audience, who doesn't actually need any introduction. So I will propose to say welcome, Secretary General, and to move straight into the discussion. One of the things that struck me about Secretary General Annan was the way in which he developed the good offices function of the Secretary General. I mean, he arrived in office, I think, at a pretty good time when the Cold War was over and cooperation of that kind was possible. But it seemed to me, Kofi, that you developed it to a degree that was unprecedented in a nicely insidious way. Would you like to tell us a bit about how you thought you did it?
Yeah. Thank you, Kiran. I'm happy to join you this morning. I mean, Kiran said in this crowd, I don't need introduction. One has to be very careful not to walk around the world thinking everyone knows you and you don't need introduction. Because when I stepped down as Secretary General, Nan and I, my wife, decided we were very tired. So we wanted to take 3 months off, borrowed a friend's house in Como, adjacent to a forest, where we could just go and walk in the forest without disturbing people in the village or without the villagers disturbing us, because we really wanted to be incognito. After 6 weeks, I was bored. And I said, let's go and get a newspaper. So we walked into a tobacconist, and within 3 minutes, a group of men, 5 men standing in the corner, kept staring at us. And one of them broke away and made directly for me. And he got to me and put his hand out. Buongiorno, Morgan Freeman. May I have an autograph? And I said, sure. I signed K. Freeman. He was very happy. The Italian security with me were also very happy. And Nan said, and besides, you are a free man. You are no longer the Secretary General, you know. So anyway, but Kiran has.
By the way, I don't think that's such a coincidence as you might think, Kofi, because my expectation is that when they make a movie about you, Morgan Freeman will be playing Kofi Annan.
No, I think Kiran has raised a very interesting issue. You know, as Secretary General, there are situations where you would want to do something, you would want to act. It didn't take very long, and of course I had been in the organization long enough to realize that we issued lots of statements about wars, about conflict, about hunger, and I was wondering if we could do more. Why couldn't we find ways of acting, becoming actors and pushing for action rather than sitting back and issuing statements? And so Kiran is right. I always found a way of taking an initiative where I think it was possible we could achieve something. The other thing which happened, and Kiran is right in the sense that in those days the council was much more cohesive than it is today, but there were times when they would quibble about a statement or how to react to a situation. As Secretary General, I could go ahead, working with Kiran and other colleagues to issue a statement, which I know is the right thing to do. And sometimes, 3 or 4 days later, after the council has struggled for a while, they will come back and endorse the Secretary General's position. I also felt that as Secretary General, one of my responsibility was to try and keep the council viable. Because if the council was not viable, my work became very difficult. And so I tried to talk to them over lunch. We organized retreats where we had open and frank discussions. And I also saw them on one-on-one or in smaller groups to discuss issues with them. It wasn't always easy. Not every council member agreed to the actions we took, but in the end they came to accept it.
I wanted to move on to, if you like, a specific example. And my view when I was observing you, because I was pretty new to I'd been a delegate 20 years before, but it's quite different to work in the Secretariat, was that Secretary-General Annan was extremely careful to lay the ground beforehand with key members of the council before taking an initiative.
Yeah.
And the first time I saw that in quite dramatic action was over Baghdad in 1997, where I think you saw the P5 several times and you had meetings with the council. Now, there was speculation that you were encouraged by Madeleine Albright to be bold on in going to Baghdad. Is there anything you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. First of all, let me say that Madeleine definitely discouraged me.
Oh, did she?
Not encouraged. And even went to the point of saying, would you go even if Uncle Sam doesn't like it and is not happy? And I said, I will go. It's my sacred duty as Secretary General to do whatever I can to try and avoid a war. But you're right. I started by discussing with the P5. I called them in to tell them what I intended to do and the planned trip to Baghdad. Then I called all the 15 members because you have to be careful. If you focus on the P5, you lose the other 10. You need them with you. And you have to let them feel they are full members of the council, because there is a tendency for people to talk about the P5 and consult only the P5. So I then consulted the 10 and then had a second meeting with the P5. And talking about Madeleine, she came to see me both in the office and at my residence with what he considered red lines for Washington. And I reminded her that I also have my red lines. The red lines I was taking with me were the council resolutions. And her red lines and mine in some areas coincided. Other areas she was far out, and I couldn't accept that. And so we did go. What was interesting was when we got to Baghdad and started the negotiations, we started with Tariq Aziz and the ministers at the Foreign Office. And it was interesting how buoyant these people were, including Ramadan, the vice president, who never smiled. He was always very severe. And for the first time he smiled. So I teased him. I said, now I discover you have teeth. And everybody laughed at him. But in any case, they were relaxed and all this. And then we had to go and see Saddam. All the issues Tariq Aziz couldn't agree to. He said, this is for my leadership, was the phrase he used. This is an issue for my leadership. And I said, okay, I will take it up with Saddam. So we had a series of issues which I was to take up with Saddam. Then I asked, when do I see Saddam? We will let you know. Do you have a date? We will let you know. So one day they came in and said, the president will see you. So I said, get the cars and let's go. So no, we brought our own cars. We'll take you in our cars. So we went in their cars to the palace. And Saddam was there. And incredibly, in the presence of Saddam, these assertive, buoyant men were like schoolboys. They were like scouts. And he gave you the impression of how he intimidated them. They were all quite different in his presence than they were in the foreign ministry without Saddam. So I got into we had general discussion, and they left, and Saddam and I had tete-a-tete to negotiate the text. To my surprise, he seemed to have done his homework. He brought out Security Council resolutions, which he had underlined, asking for meaning of words and phrases. Halfway through the discussion, he said, excuse me, I have to go and pray. So I said to myself, well, if he prays at a moment like this, then maybe all is not lost. And so he left, and I turned to the interpreter, who has been with him for a while, and asked him, am I getting through to him? He said, yes, yes, yes. Anyway, he came back, and we were able to come to an understanding on the outstanding issues. Do you have difficulty hearing me at the back? Okay. So he came back, and we resolved the outstanding issues. And what was interesting was, for the first time, Iraq allowed lots of press people to come in, almost a plane load of press for the event. And since we couldn't go in on a commercial flight, they had leased a plane, and I borrowed President Chirac's plane to take me to Baghdad. But what was interesting was when we got back to New York, the night of the agreement, Fred Eckert, I told Fred to let the press know that we have an agreement. So Fred went to tell the press, we have a deal. And the phone started ringing from Washington. Madeleine wanted the document. Woke up my staff. I said, if anybody calls, I'm asleep. And so they said the Secretary General was asleep. And they said, wake him up. They said, he doesn't like that. We can't do that. And she really pushed and pushed and pushed to get the draft. And I was determined not to give it to her. Because if you give it to her and to the Americans, they will go and interpret the agreement to the others and prepare a ground to create difficulties for you. So I was determined she will get the agreement, but at the same time as the other 14 members of the council, so that nobody can interpret what it meant, and I will have the chance of explaining it to the council. And that is what happened. The interesting thing is, generally the agreement was well received. I don't know, Kiran, if you were in the council with me. When we went to the council, it also shows the dominant power of the U.S. It was like a funeral. Individually, some of the members had seen me, they were happy. In the American presence in the council, it was like a funeral, very downcast. Although outside, everybody was happy, the staff. And in the end, the council ended up unanimously endorsing the agreement. But it was interesting to see the dynamics amongst the members.
So war was averted for 6 years. I wanted to move to an issue where your instincts were right, but you weren't able to act, and that is Kosovo.
Yeah.
I remember vividly a meeting you had with, I think it was the Polish foreign minister, who was the chairman in office of the OSCE.
Jeremek.
And he was talking about how the NATO was doing this and the contact group was doing that and so on. And Kofi put his fingers up like this and he said, but I don't feel it. And that you were worried that things were going to blow.
Yeah.
And you wanted to appoint a private envoy to go and make a first-hand assessment. I think you had another conversation with Madeleine about this. It's not all going to be about Madeleine Albright, by the way. No. And it does illustrate that it's not only with one American administration that you have to cope.
It continues, yeah.
Do you remember that conversation with Madeleine?
Yes, I do, actually. And Madeleine was hesitant about some of the ideas I had. And I thought they were also being too optimistic, thinking that NATO was doing. I would tell you, in those days, there were lots of people who were unreasonably optimistic about what could be done in Yugoslavia. A senior NATO and EU person told me, 3 days of bombing and it's all over. And they were quite shocked to see how resilient Milosevic was. Not only was he resilient, when you get into this sort of action in a small theater like that, you have very limited targets. Once you've hit those targets, what else do you do if they don't give up? You may go back and hit the same targets for show, for action, to indicate you mean business, and the public wouldn't be any wiser. But you know that you are running out of target. And I think on this one, Madeleine came to me and wanted us to appoint Marty Ahtisaari as an envoy. The Russians pushed hard, and what's his name, the foreign deputy president, Chernomyrdin, I think.
Chernomyrdin,
yeah. Was teamed up with Marty to do this. And Marty was a certain president, and a country that also belonged to the EU. And I said this was if somebody had retired or something, you could do it. But anyway, they went ahead and did it. And I had asked Carl Bildt and Kukan of Slovakia to run some interference for me and to try and see what they can do or can pick up. I chose Kukan because he was from the region, very sensible, and also knew what Yugoslavia meant and the way it was falling apart, and knew the parties, that he could go with Carl Bildt and talk to some of them. In the end, we all know what happened in Kosovo and the disaster that ensued.
It does illustrate, though, that as a jockey would say, you can't win without the horse.
No, it's
so
true.
you can try and ride it, but if it doesn't want to be ridden, there you are. Let's turn to one where it was very clear that your personal intervention was key to success. And I'm thinking of, again, relatively early in your term, East Timor.
Yeah.
And I remember being absolutely astonished when you phoned up the president and got him to agree to something that I didn't think anyone could possibly have done. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, actually. East Timor was very interesting. When I took over as Secretary General, there were 3 crises. On the surface, seemed very small, but I thought if we could settle them, we could have a real impact. It was East Timor, Western Sahara, and Cyprus, because they all had regional implications. Cyprus was poisoning the relations in the Aegean, particularly between Turkey and Greece. The second one, Western Sahara, had poisoned the relationship between Morocco and Algeria and had really prevented the Maghreb Union from developing in the way that it should economically, politically, and everything. And that if we could resolve it, it would unleash that union and also encourage effective trade with Europe. And the third one was East Timor. East Timor was interesting in the sense that initially I had to get Portugal and Indonesia to agree. They were negotiating, but it had gone on for so long, and I needed to find a way of bringing it to a head. The Portuguese supported independence for East Timor. The Indonesians wanted autonomy. And so I had the 2 foreign ministers negotiating with me and with Jamshid Marka as an envoy. And I managed to get them to a situation where each side felt that if there were a referendum, they would win. And so it was a perfect situation for me. And we got to a stage where Indonesians felt they could win the referendum by 80% voting to remain with Indonesia. and the Portuguese determined to test it. So we were able to put through the referendum, and of course we all know the results. But after the results were announced, the Indonesian military on the ground started destroying property and attacking the East Timorese. We had to do something to protect the people, and we had people on the ground. I called the president of Indonesia, who said, yes, there's confusion. Some buildings are being burnt, cars are being burnt, but it's not being done by my troops. I said, who is burning them then? He said, it's Indonesians who have lived in East Timor for a while, who do not want to leave their assets, cars and homes, to the East Timorese, so they are burning them before they leave. So it's not the soldiers, it's Indonesians who are leaving, who are destroying their own property. I said, Mr. President, I have people on the ground. The military are lying to you. What is happening? Let me give you the facts. It's your military who are doing this. He still wouldn't believe it. Until the Security Council visited East Timor, and I suggested they invite General Wiranto, who was the head of the Indonesian army, with them. Wiranto was shocked by what he saw. So he went home and reported, but still the government wouldn't budge. And at that time we were trying to put up a peacekeeping force to go to East Timor. I had lined up the troops. I had the lead country. Australia was ready to lead. Malaysia was going to give troops. Thailand, Singapore, Philippines. I had contacted all the heads of state, and they had troops ready. But they all said, we will only go in and participate if we are invited by Indonesia. And Indonesia was not about to issue such an invitation. And those were difficult days for me, because when the day ended in New York, it was morning in Indonesia, so I started working the phones when I got home at night with the President Habibie. And Habibie wouldn't budge. And I said, Mr. President, we are not coming to impose on you, we are coming to help you. We are coming to help contain the situation, otherwise things will get out of hand and you'll be held accountable. In the end, after weeks of negotiations, he said yes. And then we can move in the troops, with Australia leading the group. But if he had not said yes, nobody would have...
Sir, would you mind changing the microphone?
Well, apparently this is... Hopefully this is better. No, without his yes, we could never have moved the troops into East Timor and done what we did. And of course, we set up the mission. Sergio de Mello led the team, and it was the day of independence. I was there on the ground, lowering the flag, and you could imagine the inner emotions of a colonial child lowering the flag in East Timor to give them independence when I had gone through that in Ghana in my teens. Yeah.
Well, it's also a wonderful example of self-determination actually being exercised. I wondered if I could switch the subject to the Middle East. There were decades when mediation between Israel and Palestine was done essentially by the United States. We used to get regular complaints about the fact that in the view of the Palestinians particularly, but also the Arabs, the playing field wasn't level, and could we somehow insert ourselves? And you invented the quartet, which for a while anyway had the effect of producing a much more balanced policy. Would you like to tell us a bit about how the quartet came about?
No, you're right that there was a feeling that the U.S. was not even-handed. And a summit had been planned in Sharm el-Sheikh after the Taba conference. And everybody was the king of Jordan, Clinton, Mubarak. There was a fourth one. Anyway, and I was going to go there. Arafat had indicated he wasn't sure he would go. I was in the region. And so I got a call from Sandy Berger, the National Security Advisor of Clinton. He said, Kofi, we have a problem and you may be able to help. He said, the president has packed his bags. He's ready to take the plane. But Arafat says he won't go to Sharm el-Sheikh for the conference. And if you can try and convince him in the region. In fact, when I was going to the region, Kiran, you may not remember this. He tried to tell me to be careful in the sense that I can go and get stuck there. Because once you go to the region, you want to walk away with something. And if you don't get anything and you keep trying, you may be stuck there for a while. Anyway, I decided to go to see Arafat. I had several UN staff with me. I had Terry Larson and Bruce Jones and a couple of others. So we took the helicopter and went down to see Arafat. I had a very...
In Ramallah?
In Ramallah. And we had a very long conversation trying to convince him he has to go to Sharm el-Sheikh. I said, you can't sit here. Clinton is coming. The king is there. Mubarak is there. And you are supposed to be the leader of your people. And you've told the whole world that you made a strategic choice for peace. Why do you then refuse to attend a peace conference?
With the Israelis as well, was it?
Yeah, yes, the Israelis were there. Why do you refuse to attend the peace conference? He said, I'm not going. We had a long discussion. In the end, he said, I will let you know tomorrow. And we had to fly back to Jerusalem. I decided to do a bit of public diplomacy. When we came out, there were lots of 3 television cameras there. So I did an interview with them, saying that I'm confident the leader, the chairman, is going to be in Sharm el-Sheikh. He's the leader of his people. He's made a strategic choice for peace. He cannot sit this conference out. And we are all expecting him there, and I'm looking forward to seeing him. So are the others, blah, blah, blah. We went back to the hotel, turned on television, none of it. The next morning, none of it, and we realized they were all Palestinian cameras. So they did the interview but never put it on. So that was the end of my public diplomacy on that issue. And on the way back, the staff kept saying, do you think he would come? And they were sort of debating and taking percentages. Some said 60% chance. I said, he will come. So by 7:30, 8 o'clock, they were at my door. Has he called? I said, no. 9 o'clock, he hadn't called. About 10 minutes past 9, he called and said, I shall come. And the phone went down. The shortest conversation I've ever had with him. And he did come. But when we got to Sharm el-Sheikh, an interesting thing happened. Neither the EU nor the Russians were invited. And I told Mubarak, I said, why haven't you invited the EU or the Russians? He said, I'm only a host. This is an American conference. So check with the Americans. So I checked with the Americans. They said, check with Mubarak. We are in his hands, So we went back and forth. I pushed, and in the end we got them to invite Solana, the European Union representative. But they did not invite the Russians. And so after the meeting, I made the suggestion that, look, if we could get everybody together, US, Russia, EU, and the UN, key players, and formed a quartet, and we worked together and had a common framework that we all pushed to implement, we may make progress. That was how the quartet was born. And then the Russians were brought in. It was after Sharm el-Sheikh. And it was an interesting experience, as Kirin indicates. You attended some of the meetings.
I did, yeah. I came to Sharm el-Sheikh, actually.
Yeah.
I was having a relaxing weekend in Woodstock, and I got this phone call from the Secretary-General saying, Come down. Like to New York, but no, Sharm el-Sheikh.
But what was interesting was that not only was a quartet formed, but at our meetings, it became very obvious that the U.S. role was not very constructive. Any issue you put on the table, Israel won't buy this. The Israelis will not accept it. So you weren't sure whether they were lawyers for the Israelis or peacemakers, and it became very difficult. It got to the stage where at the end of our meeting, as a quartet, we would issue a statement, and I would feel compelled as Secretary General to issue my own statement, which used to drive the Americans crazy. But the way they were playing at the quartet level was not fair. In the end, the quartet couldn't deliver much. But it could have if we had really played it well.
It had balance, and that was important. But then it became progressively more an American instrument, and its usefulness declined accordingly. You were also active on Lebanon in relation to the issue of whether the Israelis had withdrawn from Lebanon or not. You remember the exercise of the blue line? The blue line.
Yeah, we had to monitor the withdrawal of the Israeli troops from Lebanon. And there was a sense that the Israelis will never withdraw. The council passed a resolution, and we had to monitor the withdrawal. We also had to assure the Israelis that the UN troops in southern Lebanon will monitor the border, which meant that we had to also try and beef it up. So the idea was Israelis will withdraw, the Hezbollah forces will also withdraw and go to the other side of River Litani and keep the border relatively free from militants and also Israeli troops. And I must say, we were lucky to have had somebody like Barak, Prime Minister Barak, to work with. He had a bit more faith that some of these things could work. I'm not sure what would have happened if we had to deal with someone like Netanyahu in the mood he's in today. But Barak had hope and worked with us, and the troops withdrew. This was 2000. And we drew the blue line indicating that the Israeli troops have withdrawn. But there was a little bit of territory which was still in Israeli hands, the Shaba farms. And the Shaba farms were a very small area. In fact, I was discussing with Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to give it up. And I had a feeling that he was thinking about it just before he died. We were on this together. It doesn't mean anything because after they withdrew, I went to see Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and our colleague Ahmed Fauzi acted as interpreter, the two of us, and Nasrallah, and one of his aides. He couldn't come to me because he was afraid the Israelis were after him. So I went to his headquarters. They were. So I went to his headquarters to see him, basically to tell him, you have maintained that your goal was to ensure departure of Israeli troops to liberate the Lebanese lands. You've done that. The Israelis are gone. And so I would urge you to transform your movement into a political movement, a political party, and disarm. He said, well, thank you for the advice. We have done our duty. Now it's up to the politicians to do theirs. We are watching them, and the people are watching them. And he threw out the phrase, watching them as if it was a threat. I had gone to see Nasrallah because I had asked Prime Minister Hariri and the President Emil Lahoud, to tell Nasrallah to disarm. Both of them said, we cannot do that. And I realized that they couldn't do that because at that stage, Hezbollah was as popular as the resistance in Paris after the war. And no politician was going to get on the wrong side of a group that popular. And so I decided to go and tell them myself. And then the Prime Minister asked me, why did you go and see him? You're giving him an influence and authority. You're making him feel important. I said, I did because you wouldn't do it. Any case, Nasrallah, in the end, kept his guns and formed a political party and became a factor in politics in Lebanon. And the last elections, he and his allies have done very well. And it's going to be interesting to see how they play their game. And then, of course, there was the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, where I also got very actively involved. We got involved because the Americans couldn't even go to Lebanon. Condi couldn't go there because the Lebanese and the Arab world felt they were so solidly on the side of the Israelis and that they had taken sides. And so I think we did 13 countries in 10 days, having borrowed a plane from the Spanish government, trying to get governments to put pressure on Israel to cease its military activities in Lebanon, because Lebanon infrastructure was being destroyed. In the end, we got the council to agree to a resolution for cessation of hostilities. And that's what's interesting, because we've seen similar resolutions recently on Syria. The council passed a resolution on cessation of hostilities. That's what took me to the region. Bolton was then the American ambassador, and de La Sablière, the French ambassador, worked together. So I called them both and I said, look, you've passed this resolution, but you haven't spoken to the parties. Ceasefire doesn't happen like that. You have to fix a D-Day. The time it goes into effect, you have to give them 24, 48 hours to instruct all the soldiers down to the foot soldier at the in the theater to stop shooting. Bolton said, the resolution says immediate. Immediate is immediate. I said, it doesn't work that way. So I decided I will do it myself. So started negotiating with Prime Minister Signora and Prime Minister Olmert of Israel on the D-Day and cessation of hostilities. The Lebanese wanted to agree immediately. The Israelis wanted 48 hours more. Olmert told me, we are not asking for more time to attack, but to organize our troops for withdrawal. And he argued legitimately that withdrawal is one of the most serious maneuvers for armies in the field. So I said we agreed. But during that 48 hours, Israel did the most damage. They dropped lots of cluster bombs in Lebanon. And but in the end, we did get cessation of hostilities. But there were other conditions. Israel had blockaded Lebanon. It had to be lifted, and I had to work with UK, with Germany, and other countries, almost setting up a naval task force to help them lift it. And also getting European countries. And for the first time, they agreed to deploy troops without American participation, because we had to strengthen the UN forces in southern Lebanon and on the Israeli border to convince the Israelis that the international community is ready and will try and hold the line on the border. And therefore we could get an agreement and withdrawal. But it was a hairy and difficult period.
I can imagine. Now, everybody here is a former UN civil servant and therefore an official. So the next issue I wanted to raise with you, if I might, is one where you would not have got success if you had gone through officials, and where you had to bypass officialdom and go straight to the heads of state concerned. And I'm sure you know that I'm referring to, that there may have been others, to Bakassi.
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us about your involvement? Because this is a peninsula between Nigeria and Cameroon, and it's a swamp, basically. I've been there. You sent me there, actually. It's a swamp. And it's hot and fetid, but it does affect the maritime boundary. And the sea off there is very rich in oil, hydrocarbons. So, and it looked like a war was was likely to break out.
Yeah. No, it was a very tense period. They've had lots of near misses between Nigeria and Cameroon, almost going into war. And eventually they went to the International Court. And they were still making noises that even if the court came up with a judgment, they weren't sure they would honor it. It's their national right to decide what was to be done. So I spoke to the Chief Justice of the court, and I said, I don't want to know the judgment. I'm interested in the timing. Give me about 3-4 months warning when you're about to issue your ruling, and I would want to work with the two governments in implementing the decision of the court. So I spoke to President Obasanjo and President Biya. I said, you've done well going to the court, but it doesn't matter going to the court if you are not going to implement the decision. And I would want to help you implement the decision. And I invited them to a meeting before the judgment came and laid down some conditions and indicated that we would want to help them by setting up a mixed commission. And I would appoint the chair of the mixed commission, which turned out to be Kirin, and also indicated that the UN, between the two of them, they had more money than the UN, and so they would pay for the cost of the proceedings. So we got both Nigeria and Cameroon to pay, and Nigeria had rigs in the Bakassi Peninsula. And I think it worked very well that with a mixed commission chaired by Kirin, we did the borders and did the demarcation. And Nigeria even withdrew the rigs from the sea very quietly. But during the negotiations, Obasanjo was very clever. He would come to negotiations in Geneva with a governor or senator from the states concerned. And I would ask him, gosh, you have a large delegation. He said, I want them to hear what is going on. I want them to hear how tough it is to get an agreement and why we need to implement it. But he himself was very difficult. I mean, at the beginning, his opening gambit was, okay, we've lost the case. I don't think they really lost. They gained some. They got some. He said, generally, they've done better than we have. And then he turns to the president of Cameroon, Biya. He said, I have a proposal. Rent the territory to us, Nigerians, for 50 years and lease it for 50 years, and after that, it reverts to you. And the president of Cameroon would look at me. He said, Mr. Secretary General, is he serious or he's pulling my leg? And Obasanjo said, I am serious. It's either that or it may be war. I'm trying to prevent a war, you know. And in the end, we got them to agree and to honor the work of the mixed commission. And years later, 5 years later, there was a celebration of their 60th or 50th anniversary. And they invited me on Obasanjo. And when they mentioned Obasanjo's name in the stadium, he got a huge applause as if he was a national hero. because they were very pleased that for the first time the two of them came together in a preventive way to avoid such a conflict. And I think Kirin and the mixed committee and all, they all did a very, very good job. And to get them to pay was also very good.
Well, I think the thing about it that struck me was, first of all, that you managed to get access to President Biya, who must be one of the most reclusive heads of state in the world. And I think you tracked him down to the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva. And then secondly, the essential work was done at a meeting we had with the two heads of state without officials. The Secretary-General said he wanted to have a private chat with the two heads of state, and he got them to work out that, first of all, that they honoured international law, and then we sat down, if you remember, and we actually drafted a text. And we got the two heads of state to agree to the text. And then we showed it to the officials. And I can still remember the looks of horror on the faces of the officials at the thought that their heads of state had committed themselves to something that they themselves had neither drafted nor approved, and they fell on it like wolves. But it was too late, because the two Kofi had got the signature of the two gentlemen on the document already, so it existed. Now, I do want to open the floor to...
if I may ask...
I'm sorry.
And this is a very important thing, because even in the Kenya negotiations, I had to stop negotiating with the two teams of 5, because for 6 weeks they wouldn't...
This is after the Kenyan elections.
After the Kenyan election in 2007, 2008. 6 weeks they couldn't come to an understanding. So one morning I told them, this process is over. I'm not sitting with this any longer. And I told the press, the process is... the negotiations were over, but the process continues. And I went to the two leaders, Raila and President Kibaki. I said, I've done my work. Your team doesn't seem capable of an agreement. 1,000 people have died. I don't know how many more you want to see dead. And this is my proposal. We should have a national government and blah, blah. And that's how we did it. Because the officials would have interfered. We had the same situation during the Millennium Summit. I don't know if you recall, we said we wanted a meeting of the heads of states without officials. The officials were very upset. This wouldn't work. It's a disaster. The heads of states loved it. Without anybody pushing a piece of paper in front of them, telling them you can't do this, you can't say that. And they really would have loved to continue that process. Thanks.
I wanted to say that I would like to be able to open the floor to questions. There are lots of things I wanted to bring up with you, but we've kind of run out of time. But I would encourage people to bring them up nevertheless. Things where it didn't work because the parties didn't want it. You mentioned Cyprus as one of your 3 targets at the beginning. Western Sahara is another. I suppose Iraq in 2003 and afterwards, particularly afterwards, would be yet another. And if we'd had more time, I would like to have encouraged you to speak about the way in which you succeeded by stealth and patience in bringing the issue of human rights much more onto the agenda of the Security Council, because I can remember the first time when Mary Robinson proposed to go down and brief the Council on human rights, and she was told, what's Niet in Chinese, but the Chinese equivalent of Niet by the Chinese, and when you wanted to talk about something which had a human rights component, they insisted that she sit back in the third row behind you, and a commitment that she wouldn't speak. But who would like to ask the Secretary-General something or make a comment? Martin, I see Martin Barber over there, another one of your old colleagues.
Hello. Thank you very much, sir, for that fantastic insight into the way you did business. You said that NATO ran out of targets in Kosovo, but President Assad doesn't seem to have run out of targets in Syria. And recently we had the chemical weapons case where many top political leaders said this is a crime which must not be allowed to become normal. And what I wanted to ask you really was, why do you think the crime of bombing hospitals has been allowed to become normal? And why do you think there hasn't been more global public outcry at this violation of our basic humanity? And what do you think we, as ordinary citizens, could possibly do about it?
That's a difficult question. No, I think Syria has become it's a very complicated theater. And I would also say that there's quite a lot of fighting or mini wars taking place in Syria, which has nothing to do with the Syrians. You have lots of proxy wars going on. I mean, recently we were given a taste of it between Iran and Israel. That has nothing to do with Syria, you know. And of course, on the issue of chemical weapons, the inspectors are in, and when they come up with a report, the question then is, what does the international community do? Does one go in and bomb and make the situation much worse? Or what happens? I think we have very bad choices in Syria on this issue. I think as individuals, we can encourage our governments to be sympathetic to Syrian refugees and Syrians running away from conflict to save their lives. What I find difficult in Syria today is that the divisions are so deep, divisions between the West and the Russians. And yet the only way, in my judgment, we can resolve the conflict in Syria is by getting everyone to agree a common framework. And by everyone, I mean the international group, the council, the regional powers, and the Syrians themselves. In fact, that was the basis of the Geneva Communique of 2012, which I got everyone to sign, Madeleine Albright, Lavrov, and all that. The key paragraph in that communique was was a reference to transitional government with full authority, because at that point the West was saying Assad must go, and the Russians were saying we don't want a chaotic collapse, and that if Assad were to leave, the terrorists will spread everywhere and go as far as to Russia's border. And so the idea was, if you were to agree on a transitional period of a year, 18 months, you then work out how you ease him out and arrange for a transitional government. In effect, I was looking at historically the situation in Europe after the 30-year war. They met in Westphalia, and you came up with the Treaty of Westphalia, and they stopped killing each other. We need to engineer a Westphalia moment for the Middle East, if we can get everybody to agree. Because when I hear that Russia, Turkey, and Iran are meeting in Astana for peace, if they were to come up with an agreement, there's no way the Saudis, the Americans, and others would accept, and vice versa. So the only way to do it is to have get everyone to understand they are in the same boat, and they have to come up with a framework that will save everyone, because really there is no military solution here, and in my judgment, in war, all are losers. You know, even the victor, what have you won? A destroyed state, broken people. What's the point?
By the way, reverting to your 10 years in office, I have the feeling that there were several major issues which would have been easier to handle and maybe solve if there had been more willingness to take the Russians seriously and to involve them. I'm thinking of Kosovo for one, because in the end, I think it was the threat to turn off the Russian gas that broke Milosevic. But Iraq might have been also easier to handle, because, after all, Saddam owed more money to Russia than pretty well anybody else, so they had an interest.
No, you're absolutely right. If we had, and even today, if we had paid more attention to them or their views, I think there is a tendency to suspect them. The Russians are not trusted. And also, you must remember, we all live and operate in New York and in places like Geneva and Paris. And the American press is very powerful. If you are not careful, you absorb what they are telling you almost by osmosis. And you keep the Russians and the Chinese and everything at bay. And sometimes you don't even pay attention to what they say. And sometimes, even when you answer a question, have you checked with the Russians? What do the Russians think? We should bring in the Russians. They think we are pro-Russian and anti-US. And so Kieran's point is absolutely right. And when the Russians are taken seriously, they cooperate and can help deliver.
This brings me back to your starting point, which was that the Secretary General's good offices and peace and security in the world are better secured when the Security Council, and particularly, but not just the P5, are working in harmony rather than against one another.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a question. By the way, would you like to say who you are just in case I don't know or can't remember your name, so that Mr. Annan knows who you are?
John Doherty from the Medical Service in Vienna. I misread the program. I thought you were going to talk about meditation, not mediation.
Well, that too.
Why not medication?
Well, that's...
We could have silence for the next 20 minutes.
I didn't want to mention that. You're famous for being a very calm, measured person. But all the episodes you've talked about must have been extremely stressful. As I've seen, I think all of these high-level discussions are extremely stressful on all the people involved. So I wonder, how do you keep so fit and calm and measured? Is it meditation?
Inner laughter. Laughter is very important. I get into these situations determined to do my best, always optimistic that I may make a difference. And if it doesn't work today, there's always a tomorrow. But I also work on the basis that tomorrow begins today. So you keep at it, And I laugh a lot. I like walking. I like listening to music. So I need to clear my head from time to time. And you also have to be careful when you are dealing with these situations, not to be provoked. I absolutely refuse to be provoked. I remember once an Italian journalist came to interview me, and I noticed attempts to provoke, but he went and wrote it in his article. He said, I tried 3 times to provoke the Secretary General, and I failed. And I said to my spokesman, Fred, I said, what sort of a journalist is that who comes to your office determined to provoke you so early in the morning? Anyway.
I think actually your very kind of calm and laid-back manner could be quite deceptive, because I noticed very much, particularly, shall we say, in the first 5 years before you were a complete, well-known quantity, that when there was a choice between doing nothing and monitoring the situation and being bold, you were always at the bold end of the spectrum. And we had a Deputy Secretary-General called Louise Frechette, and she told me that the Secretary-General was meticulous in consulting her, but she always had a pretty good idea that he'd already made up his mind. But that he did consult very, very widely, but at the end of that, I think more often than not you went for the bold option rather than the conservative option.
No, yeah, you remember Michael Doyle. Michael Doyle came to me after 3 months on the floor.
He was a chief planner, wasn't he? An American academic.
Who is now teaching at Columbia. He said, after 3 months on the floor, I've discovered that there's only one revolutionary, and he's the Secretary General.
Good. Who else would like to raise a point or ask a question? Please.
Yes, I'm David McFadden from ex-WHO. Secretary General,
Can you speak up a bit?
Secretary General, many of us here were involved in development cooperation. I wonder if you could share your experience of getting executive heads to work together.
Getting who to work together? Executive heads of agencies. Now there's a fast fall. We better turn off the microphones or turn off the video.
Yeah. No, that wasn't always easy, but I think there was a time when we worked pretty well together. I think one has to accept that they all have their own separate mandates, separate budgets, and there were kings or queens in their own domain, and New York sometimes can be far away. And there was a feeling that sometimes the Secretary General interferes or wants to dictate to them. But we met twice a year, and I noticed that over time, a camaraderie developed, and we were very collegiate and very close on issues of common concern. I recall after 9/11, the first meeting we had as a group, I asked them what threats they felt in their respective areas. I wish I had not asked, because some of the suggestions they made were quite frightening. You know, WHO, Gru said, my biggest fear is smallpox. Somebody can go to a clinic and get it, infect several people, and set them loose. And as they travel through the airport or walk through airports, they spread it. The IMO person said, my biggest fear is somebody bringing in a tanker full of explosive and hitting a city. And, you know, and on, and it went. And I said, you are telling me there could be worse instances than the 9/11. And the way we went around, and I think that also sort of, we shared a moment of fear, if you wish, together. That also pulled us together. But the Secretary General also has to reach out to the other agencies and work with them and give them support, not always go and make demands on them. For example, with WHO, I worked very closely with Group Brundtland and others and Piot on HIV/AIDS. We had a very successful meeting in Amsterdam where I invited chairmen of the 7 largest pharmaceutical companies to meet with me in Amsterdam. And my request to them was simple. I want you to reduce the cost of medication so that the poor could have access to it. The first chairman who spoke said, I don't even know why I came to this meeting. I could be accused of price fixing. And I said, price fixing is when you collude to maximize your profits. Here, I'm asking you to lose money. I'm asking you to cut the cost of medication. because at that time it was about $15,000 per year per person, and there was no way the poor could afford it. And they also had a court case against Mandela in South Africa for attempting to manufacture generic version of the medication for his people. I said, I'm not a public relations man. On a case like this, if you lose, you lose. If you win, you lose and lose and lose. So you better pull it out and settle. And they did. And so in the end, we got them to reduce the cost of medication. The nevirapine, which prevented mother-to-child transmission, in the end, they were given it free in places like Botswana. And so working with the agencies and being supportive also helps bring the family together. And I don't think we do enough of that.
Anybody else would like to? Yes, please. A bit behind you, and then you. Two quick ones, and we're going to be out of time.
Omar Noman, UNDP.
You need a microphone.
The Secretary General. A war that is forgotten is India versus Pakistan. And for some reason, it's lying in the back burner of the UN. And may you shed us some light on why that's the case. Thank you.
I think India, yeah. India, Pakistan?
Yes.
India,
Pakistan. Now, you did a lot on that.
No, we tried very hard to try and move the process. I think one of the most difficult part is the UN's role is not accepted by India in particular. Although directing, but we did encourage the two countries to do a lot. I was in touch with the Pakistani Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister, encouraging them to really settle. They didn't want the issue in the UN, in the Security Council, or the General Assembly. India was very firm on that. There was at one stage, I thought we were making progress. This was during the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee of India and Musharraf in Pakistan. I was in touch with both leaders, and Prime Minister Vajpayee, I think, was very serious about making peace. In fact, he told me, he said, Mr. Secretary General, for the first time, I have a sense that we can make progress. In the past, I've had a situation where if I made a deal with the civilians, the Pakistani military torpedoed it, and we couldn't move forward. But for the first time, we have a man who is military, but also has a civilian political portfolio, handling both sides, that is Musharraf. And he was genuine and seriously hoping that the two of them could settle. You remember there was a meeting in Agra. They met in Agra to discuss this, and suddenly Musharraf took off and left Agra and went back home. Up till today, I don't know the full story, why he left Agra so hurriedly and went home before they could push the process forward. And of course, the problem persists, and I'm not sure how and when it's going to be resolved. But it has to be, we have to encourage both parties and the leaders to press ahead and not give up. But they will not allow the UN this space to pull it into the Council.
The Indians, during my time, were so hypersensitive about non-internationalization that they did not want you to come on a tour that included Pakistan. You had to come bilaterally and not go back. And also they were very nervous about giving you the sort of status that you had in other countries. And I remember one of the most terrifying drives of my life was in a motorcade behind you, which was going at hurtling speed to the hotel in Delhi, but with no police escort. So we were going around roundabouts at about 60 miles an hour with no one. And I think one of the cars actually had a crash with a taxi. Now, I think we've got time for one more.
Secretary General, I'm just thinking of the time when the US and Britain wanted or were preparing to attack Iraq. And they were trying to get a UN resolution to support them in doing that. That must have been a very difficult time. And I think Tony Blair at one point said you were acting illegally trying to stop them. I wonder if you think there are any insights on that one.
He was right, but it wasn't illegal. He was right that I was very active behind the scenes, talking to leaders around the world, particularly members of the Council, from the French to the Germans to the Latins. And I think it was extremely important that the Security Council did not endorse the war in Iraq. And what was even more remarkable is that the U.S. couldn't even get the support of its neighbors, Chile and Mexico, and the African countries and the other Security Council members, because in a way, to get a resolution approved, you need 9 votes. At that time, I counted about 4 for the U.S. They couldn't have had more than 4. And that was also the time, you will remember, Claire Short said the British government was tapping my phone and listening to my conversation. I think they were not only interested in what I was saying, but they were interested in what the other heads of states were telling me, so that although later on one of your colleagues, the PR, the permanent representative, came to see me and said, Mr. Secretary General, I have a message from you from Her Majesty's government. I said, yes. He said, Her Majesty's government has instructed me to tell you that we did not bug your phone. No, we did not bug your residence. We did not bug your residence phone. And I said, how about the office? He said, my instructions was to tell you we did not bug your phone. So I came to the conclusion it was division of work. They were probably bugging my home, and the U.S. bugging the office, and then they shared the information.
By the way, when I was a British diplomat, it was quite common for us, if we agreed with our instructions, we used to say we. If we didn't agree with our instructions, we used to say Her Majesty's government. So I think we've almost come to the end of our time, but I would like to ask you a little bit about about your role in advancing the agenda of human rights in the Security Council and moving it from the subtle way and gradual way you evolved it from a non-issue to something which was actually relative. I mean, even in internal affairs of member states, something that was fairly normal to discuss, at least informally.
Yeah, no, they were very, very resistant to the idea of human rights being discussed in the Council, referring to the Commission of Human Rights, and that those issues should be discussed there. But over time, with our retreats and also in the Council, sometimes and over lunch, making suggestions that these issues can lead to conflict, and you cannot deal with conflict without talking about human rights and the rights of individuals, and that we cannot ignore this. And at the beginning, they weren't really listening. They thought I was trying to pull a fast one. But over time, they became open. I remember when Mary had to come, and I asked them to listen to Mary Robinson as a High Commissioner. They wouldn't allow her to come. They felt that her role was in Geneva, not in the Council. But when you look at the situation today, the Council is playing a rather dirty game. They are divided. On key issues, they cannot take decisions. They send it to the Human Rights Council here, and they overload the rights of the Human Rights Council, or threaten to send it to the ICC. And yet, several key members of the Council have not signed on to the ICC and don't pay a penny. I told the president of the ICC, next time the Council decides to send a case to you, give them a bill, budget implications, so that the Americans and others pay their share. But now they have discovered human rights, and they are using it, in my judgment, the wrong way, always dumping on the Human Rights Council or the ICC instead of taking the decisions in the Council.
What's your solution to the polarization and disagreement within the Council? Is there a way out of it?
I think they should talk a bit more privately. Some of the statements, I mean, of course, Trump has his own special language for diplomacy. And some of the ambassadors are picking it up, you know. But some of the statements which are made are provocative. When I hear Nikki Haley say some of the things she says publicly, or Trump himself, it really makes diplomacy and discussions. So I would say they should say less publicly and have serious discussions behind the scenes. In some cases, even come to an agreement before they come public and to their meetings and make their statements. And I would suggest that they try, in order to build confidence and trust, take on a couple of cases they can agree on and then build on to that. But that is not happening. Almost everywhere you turn, there are disagreements and loud disagreements. And when an ambassador tells other colleagues, we are taking names, we are taking note of who is against us. I mean, it's not diplomacy. It's intimidation, it's bullying, and it's very rude, you know. And no nation would accept that sort of treatment, particularly when you're dealing with leaders like Putin, who are also very strong-minded.
It's not unprecedented. I remember Paul Wolfowitz made some remarks about how our policy is to reward our friends, protect our friends, and punish our
enemies.
Yeah. Secretary General, thank you very, very much for giving us so much of your time. I think it's been really worthwhile, and I would invite you to show your appreciation.